month of February, and we're providing oversight to Senate Bill 4, and we're specifically focusing on well stimulation in California. I wanted to put on your radar screen that on March 10th, we'll be focusing on underground injection wells. Questions may come up today since it's been topical on that, but really the best focus will be at a joint hearing on March 10th with the Committee on Environmental Quality and Committee on Natural Resources and Water. So with that, thank you very much for coming. I have some opening comments, but I also wanted to point out for members that in your packet, you have a sort of a white paper, if you will, with overview of some of the issues. Senate Bill 4 passed a couple of years ago, and we're looking at the implementation of that now. How is the Division of Oil and Gas and Geothermal doing and implementing the bill? We're looking at hydraulic fracturing or fracking, as well as other stimulation techniques like acidization. There's also a chart on page 4 in the white paper on this committee, the Oversight Committee, that tells you about how many wells they're fracking, where they're located, and it's sort of a nice way to sort of see what went on in 2014 and where. It might surprise you that 99% of all the fracked wells are in the Kern County area. I thought they were all in my district, but apparently not. I wanted to give you a little bit of history because I think it's topical on how we got into this discussion. Several years ago, I think it's 4 now, I had written a letter to the Division of Oil and Gas and Geothermal Resources just asking about fracking, what we know about it. The movie Gasland had come out, and do we have fracking in California? If so, where is it? What chemicals are being used? And as chair of the Natural Resources and Water Committee, I was frankly concerned about impacts on water supply. That's what drove me into this discussion. It took a while to get a letter back, but essentially what the letter said was, we can't answer your questions because we don't know, we don't keep track of it. So moving forward, eventually we had a hearing a year or two later. It lasted over 5 hours. Those of you who missed it, I can provide you the video if you'd like to replay it. But we learned things like there's new well stimulation techniques. It wasn't just hydraulic fracturing. And so we're finding out acidization, and there's others methods still equally of concern regarding location, impacts on water supply, and what chemicals are being used, and how are we storing the waste fluids. Those are the problems. We heard from people that lived throughout the state of California where all of a sudden their water table went down because someone has conducting fracking and let a lease to oil company coming in, and all of a sudden water tables slip. In fact, Senator Jackson, it was from someone up in your neck of the woods in Santa Barbara County who had those concerns. And so during this process, we realized notification of surrounding property owners who share a water basin was increasingly important. The public's concerns about fracking, frankly, could not be addressed. And so the purpose of SB4 was simply to provide transparency and accountability in the process. The bill was signed back in September of 2013 to begin the regulation of well stimulation treatments. They are the strongest well stimulation regulations in the country. They are doing a lot of work. Today's hearing really isn't about whether there should be fracking or not. That's subject to ongoing issues and concerns, but how well we're doing, how well Dogger and the respective agencies who have memorandums of agreement with Dogger, the water boards, the air boards, DTSC, and the list goes on, how well this is working out. Are we getting the transparency and the accountability that were the 2 primary goals in SB4? right after the bill was signed into law in 2013, by January 1st of 2014, actually that fall, Dogger worked, frankly, very hard to get a website up and running. There wasn't a website that the public could look at. It wasn't user-friendly. It was one that only went through Frac Focus. So by January 1st of 2014, because I sat there on New Year's Day, that website was up and running where you could see where they're fracking. You would know about notification. You could see what chemicals were being used. And so we began that process in good faith and looking forward to continuing in that regards. The public still has questions. They still have concerns. And with newspaper articles, even in today's publications regarding benzene and some other chemicals, a lot of those have to do with underground injection wells, which again will be the subject of a very thorough discussion, looking at Rachel over here, with that joint hearing on March 10th. What else has been going on? And you'll see two people waiting patiently here. The requirements in SB4, and this is all paid for by a per barrel fee assessment. It's not paid out of the general fund, was to begin regulations. There's been hearings around the state. These are draft EIR. They'll be completed by July 1st of 2015. And we also required an independent and very thoughtful scientific review. And with us today will be the organization that is conducting that review. It'll be in 3 volumes. They've completed volume 1. I'm very interested in volume 2 particularly, and perhaps volume 3, that are supposed to be completed by also July 1st of 2015. So information is coming out. Still, myself and all of you here, and I appreciate your attendance, will continue to have a lot of questions regarding this practice to make sure it's safe, and not only during the operation of fracking itself, but my primary concern, frankly, is how do you store waste fluids successfully? How can you make sure that they don't contaminate groundwater basins? And the relationship to seismic risks, if at all. Those will be issues that'll be out in volume 2 in that independent study. So before we listen to our first 2 speakers that are going to talk very eloquently on the volumes 1, 2, and 3 on the independent study, I'd like to open it up for any members who have some opening comments. Vice Chair Stone, welcome. You're new to this committee, are you not? We do have some hazing kind of.
Oh, thank you. Turn it off. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's part of it. We turn off your microphone.
Okay, well, am I on? You're on. Okay, I'm on. I don't control this, okay. Formerly from the Board of Supervisors, we had to push a button to speak. So first of all, it's an honor, Madam Chair, to be on the committee to serve with my distinguished colleagues here, and I look forward to hearing our speakers and appreciate members of the audience and being here today, and I appreciate the goal of transparency and accountability. The issue of conventional and unconventional drilling in California brings out passionate views and arguments on both sides of the debate, but to ensure that we're receiving facts and not just in support or in opposition to the industry, I would like the proponents of well stimulation, hydraulic fracturing, matrix acidizing, and other drilling techniques to be prepared to support their statements with facts, science, and researchable data to verify that their information is accurate, correct. And on the same note, the opponents of drilling techniques I mentioned should also be prepared to respond and provide specifics on where they obtained their information, how it was researched, and most of all, be prepared to defend their statements and positions. This should also go for anyone making public comments. I suspect that the debate on this issue will continue, but if we are not privy to accurate studies, science-based information, and the ability to verify what the presenters on both sides are providing to this committee, our time here could be in vain. This informational hearing should include how best to implement SB4 and what is the best approach to ensuring that no contamination of our groundwater occurs and the best way to lower emissions without torpedoing an industry that functions within the toughest regulatory environment in the country. SB4 is the first of its kind that regulates hydraulic fracturing in any state in the union, and I'm interested to hear who believes that it doesn't go far enough and what will satisfy your position. It's also my understanding that the state sent a detailed plan to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency last week for bringing state regulation of oil and gas operations into compliance with Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. I see this as a move in the right direction, and once the review is complete, we will know that wells are in compliance and which ones are not. And I look forward to debating these issues and fully implementing SB4 with all the right information.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Stone. Any other members wish to offer some opening comments? Senator Hannah Jackson.
Thank you. Just briefly, first, I'm happy that we are here today. I think just sharing the sentiments of my colleagues, we need to have proper oversight of fracking and the threat that the potentially toxic chemical brew from fracking might have on our drinking water supplies, our health, and our environment. And I share my colleague Senator Stone's observation that this needs to be based on science, statistics, and that up until recently we had none. And I'm looking forward to hearing about what we have been able to identify. Knowledge is a very powerful tool, and one that I think I want to thank our chair for bringing SB4, because it did call for transparency and accountability, and I think that it's critical for the people of California to know exactly what is going on, where the fracking is going on. I know we've had some issues in Santa Barbara. There's some concerns in the county of Ventura that permits have been taken out to do fracking there. They've got the oldest wells in the state because they have been doing oil drilling probably for the longest period of time out of Ventura County. Was one of the first counties in the state to discover black gold. And I think it's critically important that we get all the information, and I'm thrilled that we're going to be hearing from scientists about the data they've collected. I know that we're only going to see chapter 1 today, that the other 2 will be coming, and I'm very much looking forward to those. But it's really important that we have the information we need to craft the kinds of policies to ensure public health and safety and to mitigate the impacts on the environment. There is concern about water quality. We know in the state of California that we have far too many impaired water bodies for whatever reasons. We don't have enough rain and water to begin with, so I think just getting a handle on this issue is really going to be very helpful, and I appreciate your coming today, and I appreciate what we're going to hear today. And in July, is it when the final report is due? So thank you all, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Jackson. I had my staff pass out not only a hard copy of the where the well stimulations occurred last year, public always asks, but on the back of it is a timeline. I think you and your constituents are always perhaps asking questions. When these certain studies will be completed, when will the EIR be completed, where are they having hearings? That's all on the website, but that's sort of a synopsis of it all. Looking at the agenda for today's hearing, we're going to hear for 15 minutes an overview of the independent science study from Dr. Amber May. She's Deputy Director of the California Council on Science and Technology, and Dr. Jane Long, also with the California Council on Science and Technology. Then we'll focus on regulatory implementation, about a 40-minute presentation by Dr. Mark Neckenham and Dr. Steve Bolin, Oil and Gas Supervisor. That's where you can ask your hard questions. No. And then the State Water Resources Control Board, we'll hear from them. They're very involved and engaged in monitoring hydraulic fracturing or acidization, any kind of well stimulation technique. And last but not least, a stakeholder panel meant to be fair in allowing sort of different points of view and different perspectives regarding well stimulation, and we'll be hearing from a representative from WISPA and the California Independent Petroleum Association, as well as staff scientists from NRDC and an oil and gas program manager for the Clean Water Action. So hopefully this will give you, over the next about 2 hours or so, a good background on this process. So let's go on to panel one. They're sitting patiently and ready to go. So Dr. Amber Mace, you're leading off. And this is for volume 1 on this independent study.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Good afternoon. My name is Amber Mace. I am the Deputy Director of the California Council on Science and Technology, and we appreciate this opportunity to speak with you today. The purpose of this briefing is to give you a high-level overview of the findings of Volume 1 and give you some details on what will be in Volumes 2 and 3 without disclosing any of the findings, because those are still under development and haven't been peer-reviewed yet. And these are the volumes that were called for in SB4, and we were tasked by the California Natural Resources Agency to conduct this important work, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to participate in this. So first, a little bit about CCST, and then I'll talk about the process that we use and our partners, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Jane Long. The California Council on Science and Technology was created based on an Assembly concurrent resolution. So it was based on the vision of leaders like you who recognize the importance of an independent source of science to inform the decisions that you make on a daily basis. And the California Council on Science and Technology has been conducting this important role since 1988, and it does so in many ways, one of which is to develop reports such as the one that we're going to be presenting findings on today. And it's dedicated to providing impartial expertise that extends beyond the resources or perspectives of any single institution. So we serve as conveners. We convene across the institutes of higher education and the experts throughout California to provide information in answer to your questions. We have issued many peer-reviewed reports on, we do this by convening the state's foremost technical experts to address some of society's toughest challenges related to water, energy, innovation, and STEM education. And our role is to oversee a very rigorous process. And we do this by convening a study team with the appropriate range of expertise for the task, by providing a balance of viewpoints on this team, by screening for potential conflicts of interest. And just as a note, point of view is different than a conflict of interest, and so having balance on our panel is very important. We also conduct a very rigorous and extensive peer review by experts who did not participate in the development of the report. They also undergo a conflict of interest screening. This process is modeled after the National Academies, which is a nationally recognized process, and it ensures that the product that we produce for you is both credible and responsive to the study charge, most importantly. So we do this in partnership with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and they are a highly recognized Department of Energy lab. And more to the point, they do state-of-the-art research on well stimulation technologies and their impacts, and they have been a wonderful partner in this throughout the process. We also have a number of additional subcontractors who partner with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jane Long to give you an overview of the findings.
And committee, oops, is it on now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. It's my pleasure today to talk to you about some of the work that's been going on with a very intense team of scientists over the last 9 months or so to try to unravel some of the facts and impacts of well stimulation technology in California. As Chairman Pavley mentioned, we're going to produce 3 reports. The first one has been reported, and that's the one I'm going to talk to you about today, which is about actually describing the technologies, how they're used, and what their future use might look like in California. The second volume, which is now in draft form, talks about the impacts in California to water, to air, the seismic impacts, the health impacts, and the impacts to animals and ecological regions and plants and animals, essentially. The third volume will be a volume that takes it down to a geographical location. So we'll look at 4 different locations in California and really try to understand those in great detail in terms of what the impacts are and what could be done about it. And finally, by popular demand, we're going to produce a 4th volume, which we probably didn't tell you about, but it's quite clear that these technical volumes, 1, 2, 3, are not going to be understandable by very many people, and they're extremely long. Probably the total of those 3 volumes will be over 1,000 pages. So we will produce a summary report in a vernacular language to try to pull together what we actually learned out of doing this in a way that's absorbable. So that's news. This one? Okay. Good. So as Senator Pavley mentioned, almost all the hydraulic fracturing is happening in the San Joaquin Valley, but you asked also about other technologies, about not only using fluid pressure to break the rock and thus increase the ability of that rock to conduct oil to the well, but also using acid to do that, so that you inject an acid and that acid etches the sides of the fracture and allows oil to travel through those etched areas of the fracture. And then the third technology, which is matrix acidation, where you pump an acid into the rock and etch out the pores. And what we found in California is that acid fracturing just basically isn't done. California doesn't have carbonate, doesn't have limestone, essentially, reservoirs, so it doesn't work here and we don't use it. Matrix acidizing is done, but it's done as a very, very small percentage of the total number of well stimulations. Almost all well stimulations in California are hydraulic fracturing. So most of my remarks today will follow for hydraulic fracturing, not for all of well stimulation. We also found that very small amounts of these technologies are being used offshore. So most of what you're concerned about is well stimulation in the San Joaquin Valley. And just to show you this map of it, 85% of the well stimulation is just in 4 fields in the San Joaquin Valley. These are fields that are mostly diatomite reservoirs. That's a type of rock. It's kind of like a closed cell foam. It's very it has a lot of porosity, it has a lot of space in it, but you can't push the oil through because it's in these closed cells. So the fracturing opens those up, and 96% of all the fracturing is in the southern San Joaquin. So basically, this is the location of the issue. About 20 to 25% of all the oil and gas that's produced in California is produced from wells that have been stimulated, and largely, again, with hydraulic fracturing. So if you look at this diagram, the size of the circle shows you how much production is located in that area. So you can see again that almost all of our production is coming from the San Joaquin. You may have been first, but you're not the biggest anymore. And the dark green part, or the dark part of the circle, is what's being produced without well stimulation, and the light part of the circle is what's being produced with. So basically, if you stopped hydraulic fracturing, you would stop about 20 to 25% of both the oil and gas production. Most of the gas that's being produced in California is being produced along with the oil. There's gas wells up in the Sacramento around here, but they are a very minor part of their gas production, and they do not use well stimulation. It's very, very rare to use well stimulation in gas wells in the Sacramento Valley. So basically, the issue we're talking about is about 20% of oil, about 20% of gas, and almost all of it in the San Joaquin. Basically, we are different than other states. In some of the states that have made fracking a common name in households today, the hydraulic fracturing that's takes place because they can drill very deep wells down to a layer which contains a lot of oil but is not very permeable. And you can drill a very long reach horizontal well through those layers now. That's another technological innovation that's made this possible, and do a lot of hydraulic fractures all along that horizontal well, and an industrial style process bring up oil and gas in that horizontal reach well. In California, we're doing almost all our fracking in these diatomite reservoirs. They require fairly shallow wells. They we don't drill very many horizontal wells. Most of these wells are more or less vertical. So we have very short reach wells, and they're near surface, and we're not doing these long reach wells. Well, as a result of that, when you do a hydraulic fracture in these wells, you don't have to fill up that long borehole. So for that one reason, we use a lot less water. But we also use a lot less water in California because of the style of hydraulic fracturing that we use. Hydraulic fracturing basically takes a zone in the borehole and isolates it and then pumps fluid in until the pressure is so large that it breaks the rock. Depending on the type of rock and depending on the type of fluid you put in there, you can get different kinds of cracks. So in California, we tend to have vertical wells and we tend to produce a single large crack that connects to a bunch of other fractures that are already there. And we don't have to use a lot of water to do that. We use a thicker water. We use a gel-based fluid to do that. In the East, where things have been, where the very well-known issues have taken place, they're using something called slick water, which basically is a water that's very slippery. And they use a lot of it because they don't have any fractures and they want to produce a whole fracture network. So for that reason, they're also using a lot more water. So in our case, we have shallow wells. Here's the distribution of wells. Here you see along the bottom axis the depth of the well, and this is a histogram. And you can see that almost all of our wells that are being fractured are less than 1,000 feet deep, about 300 meters. So there's this very shallow fracking. In the East Coast, in the East where they're doing this, the wells are thousands of feet deep. So California has a different type of fracturing and a different geometry to the well. This is the distribution of water that's used in California hydraulic fracturing per episode. So each little bar on this graph represents, or each little dot on the graph represents an operation that used that amount of water that's along the bottom axis. And what you can see is that almost all of these hydraulic fractures are using less than 500 cubic meters of water. And if you note on the right, there's a vertical line on the right, shows the amount of water that was per frac that was banned in New York as high volume horizontal well fracking. So you can see that if California for some reason decided to institute the same ban on hydraulic fracturing that New York did, it would make very little difference to operations in California. We don't use the same kind of hydraulic fracturing that was banned in New York. So I think I'll skip. This is the location of where those shallow wells are, but they are where the hydraulic fracturing is. So the next question has come up about the Monterey. The Monterey is a kind of touchstone that everyone believed was going to open up vast new reserves of oil and lots of new development in California. And this shows a footprint of the Monterey. And the Monterey formation is what we call the source rock. In other words, it's where the oil was formed for a lot of the conventional reservoirs that are being produced today. So oil is produced deep in these source rocks, and it migrates up to conventional reservoirs where we produce it. The big revolution in fracking throughout the country is that you're now able to turn source rock into reservoir rock. So source rock tends to be very impermeable. It's hard to produce. With fracking now, you're able to go right to where the oil is formed and produce it. So what you're seeing in the orange is that part of the Monterey Formation, which is in what they call the oil window. In other words, it's deep enough, it's experienced enough pressure so that if there's carbon there, oil would be present there or would have formed there. It might not be there now because a lot of oil has migrated from these source rocks to the conventional reservoirs. So the EIA, the Energy Information Agency, in 2011 came up with an estimate that got everybody excited, which was that there was going to be 15 billion barrels of oil, and that the Monterey was going to be the biggest resource for this source rock, this oil shale rock in the United States. And you see the Bakken and the Eagle Ford much smaller. Well, in 2014, they revised that, and that tiny little sliver up there with a 0.6 is now the Monterey. And meanwhile, the Eagle Ford has grown dramatically. The entire estimate of what could be gotten out of source rocks in the United States has gone up by 30%, whereas the estimate for the Monterey has gone down by 90%. So basically what our team did is look at these estimates, and we concluded that neither one of them were very good, that the right low range might be 0 and the right high range might be higher than this or lower than this, and that basically the situation is there isn't a lot of data. These rocks are very deep, they're hard to get to, it's expensive to drill into them, and we don't really know how much is there. So I think the idea that in the next few years we would all of a sudden have a boom economy on taking oil out of the Monterey seems unlikely to us. It's not that it couldn't happen, but it's not tomorrow. It's going to take some time to understand whether those rocks, first of all, still have the oil, and whether we can reach it economically and produce it economically. Meanwhile, California is the third largest oil-producing state in the country, and the conventional resources we have are pretty dramatic. Most people don't know that, for example, the LA Basin has the single most concentrated reservoir of oil in the entire world. And these reservoirs, in and around the reservoirs that are being produced now, have been estimated to have an additional 15 billion barrels. It's kind of interesting that it's the same number of recoverable oil, and this is pretty solid information. So I think we know how to produce these, and we know that they're there. And so our conclusion is that if these well stimulation technologies are going to be used in the future, they're very likely to be used in and around the places that they're being used now. It's not going to be a whole new play in the Monterey in the very near future. Not that it couldn't happen in decades hence, but it's going to take years. So what I'd like to do is share just a few results on impacts with you on chemicals, water, and seismicity. These come out of a prior report that we did for the Bureau of Land Management, and they're kind of a hint of what's coming forward. On the chemicals, we did assess those that have been reported, and GHS stands for the Global Harmonization System, which is a ranking of toxicity. And of the hundreds of chemicals that we looked at, we found in that report that only a few were highly toxic, and that about a third of them had no data on toxicity. Many of them are not highly toxic. What's coming in the new report, it will be some greater understanding of, greater assessment of these toxicity of these chemicals, not only from this measure, which is a measure of acute toxicity. In other words, if I feed a concentrated amount of this chemical to an animal, how much does it take to kill the animal? But there are other kinds of toxicity. There's long-term chronic toxicity. So we're going to try to look at some of those issues and see what we know about them. But fundamentally, the issue here is the sheer number of chemicals that we have to deal with. Some of these chemicals don't have an assay method. There's no approved way to understand how much, how to even measure them. Most of them don't have any chronic toxicity data, and not all of them even have acute toxicity data. So one of the issues we face, and that we'll be writing more about, is what the implications are of having so many different chemicals in this mix. We also found that flowback water and produced water at some level are going to be commingled. So if you put this soup of chemicals down to create the fracture, and then you bring back up some recovered water, you may dispose of that differently, but over time you are producing the well, and in California, 90% of what you produce on average is water. And that water will contain some of the chemicals used for fracking for a very long time. And we saw that some of that produced water was going into unlined pits, which is something that has been banned almost everywhere. And we also saw that some of it was being potentially used for irrigation. And we don't know if those situations are excluded, if wells that are being fracked are excluded from that or not. And we're looking into that. And as well, we also have an issue that I don't have a slide for here, but because we have the shallow wells, we lack the sort of protection in California. We lack the protection that is from the deep wells. that are being fracked elsewhere. So where deep wells are being fracked, the fractures can only get to be about 600 meters long. They're physically unable to make one larger than that. So if you're thousands of meters below a water table, you can't propagate a fracture into an aquifer. In California, our wells are 300 feet, or 300 meters, sorry, about 1,000 feet. So we're looking into whether or not these fractures have a possibility of getting near fresh water. Many of these wells that are being fracked are in regions that have no fresh water, but some of them might, and so we're looking at that. And finally, on the seismicity question, in general, we found very little evidence at all that hydraulic fractures were causing any kind of earthquake. There's one recorded earthquake that was very slow. It was anomalous in that it didn't create any shaking. It was a very slow movement, and it was back in, I believe, 1981. And then, in general, the big seismic issue is generally not hydraulic fracturing. It is the disposal of fluids from that are produced along with the oil. So if you have to produce a large volume of water and you have to dispose of some of that, that injection is a seismic hazard. So far, we haven't been able to identify any correlation between earthquakes in California and the disposal of that water. But you have to keep in mind that California has so many earthquakes that it's very difficult to establish causation because we have earthquakes all the time. So we're looking at that in more detail. So again, volume 2 will show you impacts on water, atmospheric impacts, more on into seismicity, traffic noise and light, human health, ecological impacts and hazards. We're trying to divide what we tell you into what we know, what we don't know, and what some of the alternative practices might be that would obviate these any impacts. And volume 3, these are the case studies we'll be looking at. They are kind of issue-oriented. We're looking at the Los Angeles area because this is an area where we have oil and gas production right within an urban environment, and the San Joaquin Valley because that's obviously where most of the activity is. We're looking offshore because people asked us for an assessment of just really what is happening offshore. And so we're going to try to just sum up what we know about what's happening offshore. And finally, I did them out of order here, but the oil potential in Monterey, I think we're going to look at if it was ever developed, what would be the, we can identify the regions where that might occur and what other issues might occur in those regions. And I'd just make one final comment. Increasingly, it's clear as we do this, as we do these impacts and we look at these situations, that the impacts of well stimulation technologies are just a small slice of the impacts of oil and gas production in general. And sometimes it's been extremely hard to slice out that piece which belongs to well stimulation. To really understand this problem, you really have to look at the impacts of oil and gas in general. And I think that I'll leave you with that thought and take any questions.